Chapter 10. The Infinity Ring. Everyone joined Dak's mom at the glass case, where she carefully pulled out the Infinity Ring and held the shiny silver loop in her hands like a strange steering wheel. "Your dad and I decided last night that we want to protect this investment from being stolen and used by others. We can do that by keying the device to our DNA. No one else will ever be able to use it. Other rings can be built when and if we share the technology, but this prototype is our family's and no one else's. Sera, we're including you because of your obvious and amazing contributions." "Me?" Sera said. "You want me to do it too?" "Of course," Dak's mom answered. "I know we've been harsh, but it's only because we care about you both. We want you to feel included, and if everything goes smoothly today, we may bring you two along on a later voyage. We might even need you to control the device if we've got our hands full." Sera nodded. Dak had never seen her look so proud before. One by one, they each pricked their thumb on a sterile medical device that plugged right into a port on the side of the ring. Then Dak's mom and dad each took a turn doing some programming, conferring with each other to make sure everything was absolutely correct. And then, it was time. "The ring is programmed with the appropriate coordinates," Dak's dad said. "We're planning on spending a few minutes at our destination, but the beauty of time travel is that, theoretically, we can be back here just a split second after we leave." "Theoretically?" repeated Dak. "So for us, this trip will last a few minutes," said Dak's mom. "But from your perspective, we'll be back in the blink of an eye." "Now step back, kids," said her husband. "And cross your fingers." Dak looked on anxiously as his mom pushed a small button on the Infinity Ring. A hum filled the room, like a hive of bees had just awakened. There was a tingly vibration in the air, as if someone had just dinged 1,000 tuning forks. The dark, amber liquid within the ring glowed bright orange, filling the lab with light. Dak suddenly couldn't take it anymore. "We're going too!" He grabbed Sera by the hand and reached out to grip his father's elbow. He barely had time to see his parents' shocked faces before everything around them exploded into a tube of light and sound that sucked the lab away and threw their bodies into a chaotic spin. Flashes of alternating color and darkness flew past him, but he couldn't keep his eyes open long enough to see any detail. His ears popped and his tongue swelled and his stomach rolled and the world seemed to press in on him. He tried to scream, but the awful noise was so loud he couldn't even tell if he'd done it. Pinpricks of pain broke out all over him, inside him, as if he were beginning to crack like an eggshell, about to burst into a million pieces at any second. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it ended. Dak found himself standing on a flattened patch of grass under a sunny blue sky. His parents and Sera were right next to him, all three of them looking at him with fire in their eyes. He quickly dropped Sera's hand. "I'm sorry," Dak blurted. "I couldn't stand the thought of waiting around, wondering what happened to you guys." Dak's dad pointed a finger at him. "You have no idea what you've—" A roar behind them cut off his words. Dak spun around to see the source. About 100 yards away, scores of soldiers dressed in red coats and white pants came running over the crest of a hill. Each one of them held a long rifle with a blade attached to the end. Dak was suddenly in his element, and the coolness of what he saw before him overwhelmed any sense of fear or guilt. These were British soldiers, and those blades on the end of their guns were called bayonets. The muskets they carried weren't like modern-day weapons that could shoot bullet after bullet in rapid succession. It took a lot longer to shoot just one bullet, or ball, with the guns that were pointed at them now. That was why they had the bayonets, so the soldiers could fight like sword-wielding knights when it came to that. "No way," Dak said. "You guys were going to visit the Revolutionary War without me?" "This isn't a game," Dak's dad shouted. "We have 100 men charging in to kill us," his mom said rather calmly. Dak had to admit that the bayonets seemed slightly less cool the closer they got. Sera pointed at a copse of trees about 30 yards away, out of the direct path of the small army. "Let's run over there. They're obviously not after us because they didn't know we existed 30 seconds ago. We just happened to land in their path." Dak knew she was right. She was logical like that. Good thinking. The four of them ran to the spot she'd indicated and slipped through the outer layer of trees to crouch behind some bushes. The soldiers had surely seen them, but Dak hoped they wouldn't worry about a stray family, albeit a stray family in strange clothing. The army had come into full view now, running down the slope to the area where Dak and the others had appeared out of nowhere. When they reached that spot, the soldiers were ordered to halt by a commanding officer. Then, without any kind of instruction, they lined up in 3 perfectly straight rows, still facing the direction in which they'd been heading. "I need to fine-tune some of the satellite grid inputs," Dak's dad whispered. "Everything dealing with location is based on how things are mapped out in the future by the GPS system, but it's not quite accurate enough, and we obviously don't have the satellites now. We were supposed to be about a mile from here so we could watch this from a safe distance." "Where are we?" Sera asked. "And when are we?" Dak jumped all over that. "We're smack dab in the middle of the Revolutionary War. Those are British soldiers, and they're obviously expecting a battle with some American militiamen. Keep watching, and you'll see how organized and rigid the British are, and how wild and crazy the Americans are. I can't believe I'm seeing this." His mom shushed him. "Quiet down." Dak felt an almost unbearable thrill of excitement as it finally hit him what was going on. They'd just traveled through time. He'd just leapt back hundreds of years using a device dreamed up by his own parents and perfected by his best friend. Judging by the half-glazed look on Sera's face, she was coming to the same world-altering realization. Movement out in the ranks grabbed his attention. 3 red-coated soldiers were running toward them, guns raised. "You there!" one of them shouted. "American spies! Come out or we'll shoot!" He and his partners kept coming at full speed. "That's not good," Dak said. "Do you know what they did to American spies? Because I do, and—" Sera silenced him with a glance. "What do we do?" Dak's mom asked. "Don't worry," her husband answered with forced calm. He was pressing buttons on the infinity ring. "Keep your heads down. I'm almost there." One of the soldiers fired a shot, smoke and fire flashing from the muzzle of his weapon. The ball smashed into a tree right next to Dak's head. "Almost there," his dad repeated. But it was too late. The soldiers crashed into the trees, throwing their weapons down and grabbing at the visitors from the future. The biggest redcoat pulled Sera by the shirt, ripping her off her feet. Dak moved in to help her, but the man swung a fist, slamming it into Dak's cheek. He fell to the ground, dazed. The other 2 soldiers tussled with his parents, pushing at them roughly. Dak caught a glimpse of his dad, struggling to hide the infinity ring and work on it at the same time as he was being roughed up. Dak's mom tore loose and fell on Dak, pulling him into her arms. Sera ripped herself free at the same time and jumped toward them. They huddled as a group and backed into his dad, who still fidgeted with the device. There was a humming sound. The trees around them started to shake. Dak saw one of the soldiers pick up a gun he'd dropped. The bayonet on the end glinted in the sunlight, breaking through the branches above them. He lifted the gun like a spear and charged at their small group. Sera's arms came up, as if she could actually deflect the vicious blade. Everything around them turned into chaos and color and sound. Dak, his parents, Sera, all of them were ripped from the copse of trees, sucked into a wormhole. In that blur of movement and noise, Dak felt as if his body were frozen, but the others seemed to be moving. Dak's mom had let go and turned to hug her husband, and the 2 of them looked as if they were dancing, the edges of their skin tendriling out like streams of their soul being torn away. Someone squeezed Dak's hand. He forced his head to move as if through a thick liquid or a tremendous wind, and he saw Sera looking at him. Still they flew through the wormhole, the rush of noise almost deafening. An object was in Dak's other hand. He knew it by touch. The infinity ring. When had his father given it to him? He didn't have time to think, just gripped it in his fingers. The lights grew brighter, the sound impossibly louder. Dak screamed, but the sound of it was lost in the madness. Then it all ended. Dak and Sera appeared on the floor of the lab. There was no sign of his parents. Anywhere. Chapter 11. Black Hoods and Black Cars. Sera couldn't quite process what was wrong at first. She just had the craziest 10 minutes of her entire life, and now she stood back in the quiet lab of Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Her mind felt a little bent, as if it had just gone up in an airplane and done loops. Parts of her body were hot and other parts were cold. Dak stood next to her, staring at something in his hands. She followed his gaze and saw that he clutched the Infinity Ring. The soldiers were nowhere to be seen, but neither were Dak's parents. He was frozen, his eyes glued to the ring. "Dak," Sera whispered. His free hand shot up, palm toward her, telling her to be quiet. She let a few seconds pass, but couldn't stand it anymore. "Dak, Be quiet!" he yelled. "They're going to show up any second now." Sera felt a painful thumping in her chest, a mix of panic and aching hurt for Dak. Something terrible had happened, and she wasn't sure why. But if his parents hadn't appeared yet, they weren't going to appear at all. "Dak, listen to me." He turned toward her, his face at first full of fire and anger, but it quickly melted into despair. His lips trembled. "What happened?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Where are they?" "I don't know." In that moment, she felt responsible. Had she messed something up in her calculations? "I'm sorry." She hated that her words sounded so empty. Dak turned on her, thrusting the Infinity Ring into her hands. "Fix this! Help them! Do something!" "Dak, we'll figure this out, but you need to calm down," she said. "Easy for you to say. You have no idea." He started pacing around the room, looking as if he wanted something to kick. But before he found anything, there was a sudden explosion behind them. Sera screamed and fell to the floor, instinctively turning her body to avoid landing on the ring. Lights danced before her eyes as the huge iron door jumped a couple of feet forward, then fell down, its ringing boom shaking the entire building. Then came the people. They stormed into the lab in the wake of the tremendous crash, people dressed head to toe in black, at least a dozen of them. "Oh no," thought Sera. "It's the SQ." Dak freaked out, punching wildly at the intruders as Sera scrambled to her feet. She was shocked and confused and suddenly terrified that these people were going to put a bullet in Dak's brain. "Dak, stop it!" she shouted, but he seemed like he'd lost his mind. Several men tackled him to the ground, subduing him roughly. Sera didn't know what to do. Her only thought was that she could use the Infinity Ring to get them out of there, but she'd barely had the idea before people were grabbing her, taking the ring out of her hands. She kicked and flailed to no avail, screaming at the black-clothed thugs. "Both of you calm down," someone yelled at them. "We're doing this for your own good." But Sera and Dak didn't stop fighting as the intruders dragged them through the door and away from the laboratory. They finally stopped thrashing once they were locked in the back seat of a car and black hoods were pulled over their heads. Sera fumbled for the door handle, but it was locked tight. It took a while for the two of them to calm their breathing, but silence eventually fell over them as the vehicle drove for miles and miles. Dak didn't make a peep as they rocketed through endless unseen streets, but every once in a while his shoulder trembled, and she knew he was stifling a sob. She wished she could talk to him, tell him that she knew all too well what it was like to have missing parents. Even though she'd never met her own, the pain was like a hole in her heart. But she couldn't find the words. If she couldn't cheer him up, she could at least try to keep him safe. She resolved to do whatever it took to get him out of this mess. On they went, turn after turn, the car silent, the mood gloomy. What light Sera could see through the coarse fabric of the hood suddenly cut out when the car pitched downward, then upright again, as if they'd gone underground or into the lower floor of a garage. There was a bang of metal, and the vehicle bounced before speeding forward again. Soon they came to a stop. Someone escorted them out of the car and led them forward, steering Sera by her elbow. Although Sera couldn't see where they were going, she kept her ears trained on Dak's shuffling footsteps. There didn't seem to be much point in fighting, but if they dared to separate her from Dak, she would try. Their captors didn't take the hood off her until they'd reached a metal door. Sera quickly looked around. They were in a dark garage, just as she'd guessed, but only a few cars were parked there. It seemed to have been carved out of rock, with uneven walls and ceiling. Dak wouldn't look her in the eyes. A blond man had them each by the arm, and he nodded toward the silvery door. "Down the elevator we go," he said. "Then all of your questions will be answered." Down the elevator they went. 3 floors down, a long hallway, a right turn, a left turn, and a second left. Another long hallway. Sera thought she'd keep track in case they had the chance to make an escape, but wherever they were, the place was built like a labyrinth. And then, finally, they reached a small room with a table and 4 chairs. 2 of those were occupied by a man and a woman. They were both about the age of Dak's parents. The man looked a little goofy, big nose, black hair sticking up, but the woman was stunningly beautiful, with dark skin and a flawless face. Sera wished Dak was in the mood to make one of his famously awkward historical speeches in an attempt to break the ice. It might bore everyone else, but right now it would lift her spirits. Dak remained silent, though. His face was sallow and droopy, and his eyes were red and moist. On the table was a spread of food that looked too good to be true. Fruit and cheese and cakes and pastries. Sera's stomach rumbled with hunger. The traitor. The blond guard motioned for Dak and Sera to take the 2 empty chairs. Then, to their enormous surprise, he handed the infinity ring to Dak. "We'll be right outside if you need us," the guard said to the woman. She simply nodded. The door closed behind him, and a weighty silence settled on the room. Dak clutched the infinity ring to his chest. The man spoke first. "Well, Dak and Sera, we have so much to say to you. It's hard to even know where to start. Don't you think we should start by telling them our names?" the woman asked, giving her partner a reproving glare. "Oh, yes, of course we should." The man cleared his throat. "My name is Brent, and this is my colleague, Mari. We, both know who you are, although I guess you've figured that out by now. Please feel free to help yourselves to some food. If there's anything else you want—" Sera had reached the end of her rope. "We had a fridge full of food back at Dak's house. You know, where we were when your goons trespassed on private property, set off explosives, and kidnapped us? We're not in very good moods, and what we want is to know what's going on." Brent had flinched at Sera's outburst, leaning back as far as he could in his chair, a look of complete shock on his face. Mari hadn't moved a muscle. "Well?" Sera pushed. "I like your spirit," Mari said quietly. "You're going to need it for what we're about to ask of you. But rein in the outbursts, and Brent will tell you everything you need to know. Brent?" Sera watched as the man shifted in his seat uncomfortably. It was obvious who was really in charge here. But Brent quickly recovered and took on a serious air as he leaned forward and folded his hands on the table. "We're members of a group called the Historians," he began. "You wouldn't have heard of us, but our organization goes back many, many centuries. It was founded by the great philosopher Aristotle in 336 BC. We've lasted in a continuous line ever since, united in a common goal to one day save the world from a disaster that only a visionary like Aristotle could have predicted. And today, you've given us the biggest breakthrough since he spoke of that vision. Time travel." Sera glanced over at Dak, who sat up a little straighter, eyes focused on Brent. She was sure he felt the same relief she did. They hadn't been taken by the SQ after all, if these people weren't lying. "Time travel?" Dak asked. "What does that have to do with Aristotle?" Brent tightened his lips and nodded. "It has everything to do with him. He knew time travel would be possible someday, and he knew what it would be needed for, to go back and correct the great breaks, to remove the remnants that haunt us, to set right the world's course and prevent reality from ending in a fiery cataclysm." The man paused and gave a long look to Sera, then Dak. "History is broken, and we need your help to fix it." Chapter 12. The Historians. There was an emptiness inside Dak unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The shock and anger of losing his parents had worn off, leaving a numbness that was somehow worse. Numbness and confusion. He had no idea what had happened, which wasn't entirely surprising. The bad news was that Sera didn't seem to know either. All he could say for sure was that they were gone, and the ache was like a choking smoke in his lungs. But Brent's words had pierced through the haze. Dak felt a spark of something. It wasn't quite enough to make him forget his misery, but it was enough to get him interested. "What does that mean?" Dak asked. "Fix history." "The world is not right, Dak, Sera. It's gone off the rails, and we needed time travel to get it back on course." "But," Sera began. "But history's, well, history, isn't it?" "Let me start from the beginning," Brent suggested. "We don't have a lot of time, pardon the irony, but you two need to have a general understanding of what we're dealing with. Are you ready for the story?" Sera gave Dak a look that told him she was worried that he was going to fall apart at any second, and he probably would fall apart if he got any sympathy right now, so he put on a dopey grin and rubbed his hands together. "I'm always ready for a story that starts with Aristotle," he said. Brent smiled. "Aristotle is my personal hero. He was one of the greatest minds of his time, or any before it. As such, he was chosen at the age of 41 by the king of Macedon, King Philip II, to become the tutor of his son, Alexander. Aristotle felt in his heart that Alexander would go on to do great things. He felt this very, very strongly. He even called the boy Alexander the Great so that he'd be aware of what was expected of him. But it all went wrong. In 336 BC, Alexander and his father were assassinated by a man named Attalus, the king's own father-in-law, so that the grandson of Attalus could be the next king instead of Alexander. That boy was Carinus, Alexander's half-brother, and he did indeed become the next ruler and went on to oversee a time of terrible darkness for Asia. Aristotle was devastated. He never really got over it. Now Dak was truly fascinated. He knew this story, of course. He'd been on a major ancient Greece kick just a few years before, but he had no idea what it had to do with anything that was going on now. He listened intently as the man continued, almost managing to ignore the ache that still swelled within his chest. Aristotle had an understanding of the world and its workings that far surpassed anyone of his period. He believed the universe had an order to it, that there is a fabric of reality in which the stories of life are woven. And deep in his heart, he knew, absolutely knew, that Alexander was not supposed to have been murdered that day. Alexander's death represented a tear in the very fabric of reality, and, being the visionary man that he was, Aristotle planned to make things right. "How?" Dak and Sera asked together. Dak went further. "How did he plan on reversing a murder?" Mari answered this time, tucking her hair behind an ear. "Time travel. He believed it was possible, not in his own era, but someday. He held out hope that mankind would develop the means to navigate the time stream, to go back and correct the things that didn't go the way they were supposed to go. Because if Alexander's fate had gone wrong, it seemed to him that other problems would likely arise as time marched on. He called these incidents breaks, and Alexander the Great's murder was only the first." "But people die every day," Sera said. "And think about how many horrible things have happened throughout history. All the wars, all the abuse, all the suffering. How could we possibly go back and stop every tragedy?" Mari was shaking her head before Sera had even finished. "It's not like that. This isn't necessarily about bad things that have happened. For good or ill, most of history is part of the natural fabric of reality. We're talking about events that never should have happened to begin with." "I don't buy it," Sera said. "Sera?" Dak began. "No. Dak, you're too trusting. I can understand that this Aristotle guy was torn up over his student getting killed. I totally get that he'd wish he could go back and change what had happened, but who is he to decide what was supposed to happen and what wasn't? How can he possibly know that?" "Because of the remnant," Brent answered. The cheeriness in his voice had disappeared entirely. He caught Sera's eyes. "Ah, I think you know what I mean. I think you've experienced a remnant yourself, haven't you? They're unpleasant as a general rule, and Aristotle experienced the very first remnant in history." "That definitely wasn't in the biography I read," said Dak. "And it was a very long biography." "It wouldn't have made any of the public records," Mari explained. Aristotle had a traumatic vision at Alexander's funeral, a vision of the great man and leader that Alexander would have become, but he knew better than to speak of it. After all, Carinus was king now, and suggesting that he shouldn't be king would have been treason. So Aristotle only shared this knowledge with a small group of trusted friends and students. These were the first historians, and they began a tradition that stretched throughout centuries and across continents, documenting the subsequent breaks. In effect, we've been recording an entire secret history. "A secret history?" echoed Dak. "You mean there's more history to learn?" Sera only rolled her eyes. Brent cleared his throat. "And all of that leads us to the Cataclysm. More than a dozen breaks have been officially listed as matching Aristotle's criteria. Everything from the kidnapping of a first lady to a botched mission in Europe during World War II that had significant consequences. These breaks not only led to undesirable outcomes, they severely damaged reality itself. The remnants are one consequence of that. The increasingly intense natural disasters are another. Everything is falling apart, as you must be more than aware." Dak thought about that. His knowledge of history left no doubt that the rate of earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, and volcano eruptions had increased dramatically over the last 100 years. But to think that was somehow tied to certain events in history taking an unplanned route was crazy. Just plain crazy. "I can see those wheels spinning in your head," Brent said to him. "I know this all must seem unlikely, but I swear to you, with all my honor as a historian, and I've devoted my life to this, that what we're telling you is true. It's a lot more complicated than we've laid it out," Mari added. "But this is the gist of it. Aristotle created a society that would diligently track and pass down records of the great breaks throughout the years, hoping that someday the historians would pioneer time travel and go back to correct what went wrong. And that's where we stand today." Brent tapped his finger on the table. "Of course, there's an even more immediate danger than earthquakes or remnants." Dak waited, wondering, what now? "The SQ," Brent announced. "They've been around just as long as the historians, though they've been known by many names. And where the rest of the world has suffered, they've actually benefited from the breaks. As you might imagine, they're not thrilled with the idea that somebody might change that." "What Brent is trying to say," Mari continued, "is that the SQ has eyes and ears everywhere. And if they were to catch wind of what we're up to here, they'd kill us all without hesitation." "We can keep you safe," Brent said. "But only if you give us that ring." Chapter 13. A Dangerous Turn. Sera didn't like Brent's tone. She didn't like this turn in the conversation at all. She quickly squeezed Dak's hand before her friend could say anything. They had to play this right. "I think the stakes are well defined here," Brent continued. "We need that ring so we can reverse engineer it, make our own, and begin the process of fixing history." He and Mari looked squarely at Dak, who held the ring clutched to his chest. Dak started before Sera could stop him. "I don't know. All this stuff you're saying makes sense, I guess, but I need the ring. I have to find my mom and dad." Sera knew Dak could be talked into anything. He was trusting to a fault. That meant it was up to her to protect their interests here, and she had no problem speaking up. "How did you people even know we had an operating time travel device? Were you monitoring the area for stray chronon particles?" Brent's eyes flickered to Mari's. Yes, that's exactly how we knew what you were up to." Sera scoffed at how easily she'd tricked them. "There's no such thing as a chronon," The historians have been spying on the Smiths all along, haven't they? You're no better than the SQ. Brent stuttered and stammered. Mari cleared her throat, stepping in to take charge of the conversation. Okay, yes, we've been monitoring Dak's parents. But we're not like the SQ. I promise you. We've only done what we have for the good of the world. How do you think the Smiths got the money they needed for their research, anyway? The historians have been funding them all along, in secret, providing grants that they didn't know came from us. Which, by the way, Brent interjected, gives us partial claim to the ring technology. Sera took a moment to consider her next move. Brent and Mari seemed genuine enough, but she didn't dare let the ring out of her sight, not until Dak's parents were safe. And if Brent and Mari had been monitoring the lab, they knew that the ring was all but useless without Sera's know-how, and without Dak or Sera to activate it. That was an advantage she could use. If you knew anything about this technology, she said, you know that it would take months to make your own device. At least. Brent and Mari exchanged a long, worried look. It was obvious they didn't have that kind of time. You need us, Dak blurted out, the excitement sparking in his eyes as he caught on to Sera's train of thought. You need us to use our own device. We have to pilot the thing. He turned to Sera. We can do this. We can do all of it at once. Find my parents, save the world. Maybe even get rid of the remnants. For some reason, that hit her in the gut like a punch. Would not having a false memory of her parents be better? Or worse? She didn't even want to think about it. But she could see that Brent and Mari knew that Dak was right. The historians did need them. We'll help you, she said. But we'll only do it if you promise to help us find Dak's parents. Take it or leave it. You'll have to leave the dirty work to the adults, Brent said. He turned to Mari, waiting until she gave a reluctant nod before he continued. While we devote resources here to figuring out what happened to Dak's parents, you can act as escorts for a crack team of historians. Our people will do the actual work of fixing the breaks, but their lives will depend on you two getting them where they need to be. And following their orders to the letter. There are the Time Wardens to worry about, after all. Time Wardens? Dak repeated. When I said the SQ had eyes and ears everywhere, I didn't just mean in the present, Mari explained. You see, if it weren't for the breaks, the SQ might not hold all the power they do in the world today. Their lady in red may not be as omniscient, seeing all. So, while we've been hoping all along for time travel to become a reality, the SQ has been dreading it. Just as we've sworn to someday go back and change the past, they've sworn not to let that happen. And they've had people trained in every generation to stop the mission we're about to undertake. There are people in the past specifically on the lookout for time travelers? Sera asked. That's crazy. It's good strategy, Mari countered. They're called Time Wardens, and if they ever even suspect that someone has come back from the future, they're instructed to kill them without blinking an eye. Sera felt a shiver of fear at that. The room fell silent, as if Brent and Mari wanted to give everyone a moment to process the danger they would be in. Dak broke the ice. Fine. We'll leave the scary stuff to the adults. Now, are you guys ever going to let us eat this food? By all means, Mari replied, smiling as she pushed the platter toward Dak. There's even some fine cheese hidden in there somewhere. Dak and Sera dug in without saying another word. Mari seemed pleased with the outcome they'd agreed on, but Sera could feel anxious energy coming off of Brent. He was clearly ready to put them all to work. Let's walk to the operations center, he said after everyone else had enjoyed a quick helping of treats. That is, if you're done eating. Dak whipped his hand out and grabbed one last cube of Swiss, then stuffed it in his mouth. Now I am, he mumbled, while chewing. As they walked down a long, dimly lit hallway, Mari gave them a few more details about what lay ahead. Sera listened eagerly. In addition to the trained members of our society that we'll send back with you, the woman said, There's also a local historian already living in the vicinity of most of the breaks. We've had a steady membership of historians since Aristotle's time, spread out in branches all over the world. Their locations are hidden, but every single one of us has always been trained to look for people from the future. Why can't they just fix the breaks themselves? Sera asked. Or prevent them? Dak gave her a look that, even in the relative darkness, left no doubt she had said something ridiculous, and she quickly blurted out the answer to her own question before he could. Oh, duh. Wasn't thinking. They don't know what a break is until after it's happened. Exactly, Mari responded. The historians have always analyzed major events of the world and, aided in part by the appearance of new remnants, decided well after the fact if an event is an official break or not. But they also know that someone may show up one day and tell them of an event that is about to take place. They're trained to prepare for that possibility. You're the pilots, mainly. Messengers. Remember that. The adults will be ready to do what needs to be done. Dak bristled. Hey, we're not moron wimps, you know. We can help, too. I don't doubt that at all, Mari said as they came to a halt in front of a large steel door. She pulled something out of a leather satchel she had slung around her shoulder, a square slate device, and held it up for them to see. All of the information you need will be downloaded to this, she said. Don't worry. We've completely overwritten the SQ software, and there are so many firewalls built around this thing that it's more secure than your own brains. It will have all the information your team will need, although, again, it'll be encoded. It's all part of a system called the Art of Memory, Brent added. Or TAM for short. It was actually devised by Aristotle so that data could be passed down from generation to generation without risking it falling into the hands of our enemies. Trust me when I tell you that it's going to drive you bonkers sometimes. But you can do it. I'll bet I can do it with my eyes closed, said Dak. That doesn't even make any sense, said Sera. Mari slipped the square back into the satchel, then gestured at the menacing door. This is the HOC, Historian Operations Center. Are you two ready? Sera glanced over at Dak, who was actually smiling. Smiling! Maybe he'd survive his parents' disappearance after all. They both nodded at each other with knowing looks. We're ready, Sera said, right before Dak added his own confirmation. The time nerds are a go! Chapter 14. Lady in Red. Mari activated a touchscreen to the right of the door and input a long series of numbers and letters, a longer password than Dak had ever seen anyone use before. This art of memory thing seemed for real, and he found himself wishing he hadn't been so boastful about it. Now, he had to live up to the expectation. A hiss sounded, followed by a hollow, grating scratch as the metal bars of the lock pulled back. Then the door popped open and swung outward with a heavy groan. In we go, Mari said, holding an arm out to indicate the two kids should go first. Dak gripped the cool surface of the infinity ring in his hand and stepped through the opening. Applause broke out, and he saw at least 20 people standing up to clap from their various stations of computers and radar screens and monitors and other equipment. They all had hopeful smiles, and for the first time Dak felt the pressure of what they were being asked to do. Save the world. No biggie, right? Mari and Brent led them around a wide walkway that skirted the outside edge of the massive operations center. The central focal point was a monitor as big as a movie screen, but instead of displaying a single image, it was broken up into dozens of views, everything from live video feed to running numbers to Doppler radar maps. While Brent plugged the square into a computer, Mari stepped up to a podium that overlooked the crew of workers at their stations. I want everyone to meet our new historians, granted membership without the usual years of proving ground. Urgent times call for urgent doings. This is Dak, and this is Sera. Another round of applause met this statement, and Dak suddenly felt like the biggest idiot ever born. He just wanted to whip out the ring and start touring history, save the world and find his parents while he was at it. But here was an entire room full of people who were devoting their lives to a noble cause, hoping all along that someone would come along and give them the means to stop an unending series of tragedies. Mari continued her speech. We have a lot to do over the next couple of days before we send Dak, Sera, and our insertion squad back in time to fix the brakes. Our current plan is to begin the operation at 0800 hours on Thursday. I know everyone's eager to begin, but we need 2 days to fully prep our new associates. She went on to say more, but Dak tuned out. He was having a heavy episode of missing his parents, worrying about what could have happened to them. 2 days was a long time to do nothing, and while he was here, they were out there somewhere, lost, possibly hurt, maybe running afoul of one of the Time Wardens. Finally, he understood a little about Sera's haunting remnant. Loss, mixed with a maddening uncertainty. He noticed Brent was looking at him expectantly. Oh, sorry, Dak stuttered. Did I miss something? Brent smiled. I asked if you were ready to start meeting people. Oh, yeah, sure. And so they started making the rounds, but all the names and faces quickly became a jumble to Dak. Some dude who was in charge of tracking natural disasters and their frequency, some chick who watched for anomalies in weather patterns, some other dude who mapped out daily world events and analyzed them for potential break material, some other chick who tracked SQ activity overseas, other dudes and other chicks who did other things. Dak kept yawning, even though he tried not to, which meant he kept doing that weird contorted face trick. Sera shot him dirty looks about every 30 seconds. One historian they met stood out from the pack. His name was Rick, and he was far younger than everyone else, with dark skin and darker eyes. He was a kid compared to the rest of the geezers in the room. Rick is an absolute prodigy when it comes to languages, Brent said when he introduced him. He learned 5 languages by the age of 5, and he set a goal to pick up 1 a year since then. You guys are supposed to be smart, the young man said. I'm 16. You've got 3 seconds to guess how many languages I know. Go. 16, Sera said, her voice laced with annoyance. Wow, Rick responded. Stunning. No wonder they chose you for this. They didn't choose us, Dak said. We invented a time travel device, and no one else can make it work. Ever done that before? Invent a time travel device? Rick rattled off something in another language. All Dak knew was that it had a lot of clearing of the throat. You need to spit somewhere? Dak asked him. Or did you swallow part of your oversized brain? If I did, maybe I should spit it out. It'd still be bigger than yours, apparently. Okay, Brent said as he stepped between them. Good to see you two hit it off so well. We'll be coming back to Rick tomorrow for some language device training. He mumbled. That ought to be fun. Next, they were introduced to Erin, a young woman with thick blonde hair. Of all the historians they'd met so far, she seemed the most stressed, clutching a disorderly stack of papers to her chest. Erin is in charge of creating a historian's guide for each break, Brent explained. She's been combing through our archives, gathering the information that will be most useful to you in different time periods. Erin shook hands with Dak, then Sera. Archives sounds impressive, but what Brent means is that I've spent months rummaging through boxes full of mildewed papyrus and crumpled bamboo scrolls. There was one 20th century historian who left behind a numbered collection of soup can wrappers. I still can't figure out if it's an important cipher or if the poor man was simply a very organized hoarder. Mari gave Erin a warm smile. It's been daunting, but Erin's done a marvelous job. I thought I'd have more time, that's all, Erin said softly, and then she wished them luck and scurried away. Dak realized too late that he should have thanked her. By the time he thought of it, they'd already made their way around the room, returning to the platform with the podium. Brent turned to Dak with a satisfied smile on his face. Now that we've done that, we want to take you to meet the people going with you on your trip. They're highly trained. The sound of an explosion cut off his words. The entire operations center rocked, throwing half of the people to the ground. Dak stumbled into Sera, and they crashed into the wall. She wrapped her arms around him to keep both of them from toppling over. There was a second boom, followed by another jolt to the room. This time Dak and Sera did fall. He landed on top of her and heard her grunt, despite the ringing in his ears. Brent and Mari both stumbled over to Dak and Sera and helped get them to their feet. For the moment, the explosions had stopped. But the historians were shouting, running around with panicked expressions on their faces. It was mass confusion. "What's going on?" Dak asked. His heart rate had skyrocketed, and he noticed Sera was holding his hand. He pulled away, embarrassed. Before anyone could answer his question, the huge monitor that dominated the room went black. When it came back online a moment later, a face filled the screen. It was a woman with flaming red hair and lipstick the color of black oil, her face all hard edges. The room hushed as everyone stared at the screen in horror. After all was completely silent, the fierce-looking woman spoke. "You really thought you could hide such a thing from the SQ?" she asked, her voice biting with hate. "We're coming, Brent. We're coming for your precious Infinity Ring." Chapter 15. A Hastening of Plans. The Lady in Red's announcement was immediately followed by a series of shattering explosions that rattled the operations room and sent ceiling tiles raining from above. Clouds of dust arose where pieces of ceiling hit the floor. Dak cradled the ring to his chest protectively. That nasty woman had threatened to come take it from him, and no way would he ever let that happen. "Come on," Brent said tightly, throwing a worried glance at Mari. "We don't have any time to mess around." He grabbed Dak by the arm and escorted him roughly up the aisle that rounded the room. Mari and Sera were right behind them. Dak noticed that Mari had retrieved the square and was hurriedly placing it back into her satchel. Brent came to a panel in the wall and pushed. The whole thing pivoted open. The four of them slipped through into a hidden room that was only about 8 feet across and completely empty. Dak turned to see Rick follow them inside. Then Brent shut the panel. "Language is going to be your biggest barrier," Mari said. "We need to get that taken care of before we can send you off. We just have to hope our defenses hold until we can get you to the insertion team." Dak tried not to show how terrified he was. "What's going on anyway? Who was that woman?" "We call her the Lady in Red," Brent answered. "Her name is Tilda. You'll never meet a viler, more hateful woman. I don't think she cares one whit about anything except amassing power and moving up the ranks. She won't be happy until she's the leader of the SQ, and she's convinced that wiping out the historians is the best way to make that happen." "Rick, quickly," Mari ordered. "Tell them about the devices." The teenager seemed to have lost some of his arrogance from before. "Nothing like an invasion from an evil red-haired lady to shake you up a bit," Dak mused. Rick pulled out several small objects from a plastic cylinder he'd had in his shirt pocket. He held up a couple of them. One looked like a headphone bud, and the other a tooth. "What the heck are those?" Dak asked. "While your parents spent their whole lives playing around with time travel," the young man answered. "Mine worked on language translation equipment. And this is so beyond what the rest of the world knows, you won't even believe it works." He stepped forward and leaned toward Dak, holding out the earpiece. Dak instinctively took a step backward. "Hey, quit being a baby," Rick said. "Come here." Dak had to push down his rising anger. "Fine." He let Rick reach up and put the tiny device in his ear, shoving it down until it almost hurt. Then he put a second one in Dak's other ear. "All right, this is the part you won't like," Rick said. Another explosion rocked the building, sending all of them teetering for a few seconds as the room shook. When the place stilled again, Dak glared at Rick warily. "Don't worry," the teenager said. "It only hurt for a few seconds." Dak was determined not to show any more fear. "Okay, what do I do?" "Open your mouth." "Open wide." Dak shot a questioning glance at Sera, who looked on impatiently, then did as he was told. Rick leaned forward and stuck his fingers in Dak's mouth. Dak gagged. It was maybe the least pleasant part of a very unpleasant day. There was an uncomfortable click that he couldn't tell if he'd heard or felt. Then a burst of pain shot through his body, and he jumped back from Rick, who was actually smiling. But the pain went away quickly, just as had been promised. "So, what is—" Rick cut him off. "No time to explain. You'll find out soon enough when you're able to talk to people in different languages. It'll take some time to get used to, but you'll be fine after some practice." Rick did the same thing to Sera, who stood still and didn't complain a lick. When Rick was finished, he stepped back and nodded to Mari. A thunderous boom sounded, and this time Dak and the others fell to the floor. They scrambled to their feet as muffled shouts rang out from the other side of the secret panel. "The SQ is in the HOC!" Mari yelled. "We can't waste another second!" Brent shouted at Dak and Sera. "Get the ring ready! You have to go now! Hurry before they storm in here and take it!" Mari seized Brent by the arm. "Brent, we have to wait for the insertion team. They're just kids. There's no time. For all we know, our team is dead." Dak swallowed, the reality of it all hitting him hard and heavy now. "Where do we go?" "It doesn't matter," Brent answered. "Just away from here. I'll come with you." Mari clearly didn't like it. "Rick can go too. You'll need all the help you can get." "Now hold on," Rick said. "But," Dak began. "No more buts. We do not have a choice." The woman pulled the satchel off of her shoulder and handed it to Sera. "Guard that with your life. You can't do anything if you lose the square. If for some reason you do, you'll have to travel back here and get a new one. But that might get messy. There's no telling what you'd be coming back to." Dak nodded, then moved to stand close to Sera. Rick joined them, looking utterly put out. There were sounds of gunfire now in the other room. Gunfire and screams. "You know how to do it, right?" Dak asked Sera, his voice tinged with hysteria. She simply nodded. He felt a pang of loss again when he handed over the Infinity Ring, as if he were throwing away his parents in some way. Sera immediately set to work on the programming function of the ring. Her face was a mask of concentration. More shots rang out on the other side of the wall. A woman screamed, a sound of pain and terror. Dak felt utterly useless, knowing that if he tried to help Sera, he'd only get in the way, slow her down. So he braced himself and waited for the next terrible thing to happen. It only took about 10 seconds. The secret panel tore from its hinges and flew through the air, windmilling until it smacked into Brent. He cried out and crumpled to the ground as Mari dove for cover. Dak looked back at the now open passage to the HOC. 2 men in soldiers' gear stood there, with guns raised, a red beam blazing out from each of their scopes. "Get on the ground!" one of them yelled. "Now!" Dak dropped, bringing his arms up to cover his head. Like that'd do any good if one of these thugs decided to shoot a bullet in his direction. Sera cowered in the corner, working on the Infinity Ring nestled in her lap, hidden from plain view. Rick crouched right next to her. "How dare you come onto our property like this?" Mari shouted. "We'll report this to every media—" She wasn't able to finish before one of the men struck her with the butt of his weapon. She cried out and fell next to Brent, who lay still where he dropped. A rage roared inside Dak, a fury that he never knew was possible all those years he'd spent reading in his room. That already seemed a lifetime ago. He charged the soldier who'd hurt Mari. Screaming at the top of his lungs, he dove and tackled the man, knocking him off balance. The second man was on Dak in an instant, dragging him by the hair across the floor while he kicked out with his feet and wailed from the pain. The man dumped him into a heap. "One more move or remark that I don't like, and someone gets shot. Do you understand me? Now where's the ring?" Dak saw in horror that the soldier had finally noticed that Sera was not just sitting there, but busy working on something. "Hey, what are you doing?" Sera looked back at him, her face lit with fear. "Nothing. I'm just scared." "You think I'm stupid? Hand it over," the man yelled. "I won't ask again." Sera had turned her attention back to the device. "Okay, just 1 second." "Now, you little brat." He moved towards Sera, and Dak scrambled to get in front of him. He landed in Sera's lap just as Rick reached over and placed his hand on her shoulder. There was a click and a beep. The world collapsed into light and sound, and they were sucked away from Historian headquarters. Chapter 16. far, far away. Sera relished the escape. The ordeal through the wormhole lasted just a few seconds, the same mind jolt of movement and streaking turns of light and darkness, the same feeling that her atoms were about to shake loose. And then it was over, without transition, that instant shift to stillness and normalcy, as if nothing had happened at all. She looked around her. She was at the foot of a giant pyramid, its huge blocks of yellow stone angling away toward the sky so that she couldn't even see its apex far above. The ground was dry and dusty, the air around them sweltering hot. She sat in the same position as she had in the hidden room outside the operations center, and the infinity ring rested in her sweaty hands. Dak was still sprawled across her lap, but quickly scooted away to lie on the ground to her right, his head resting against a block at the bottom of the pyramid. And Rick was standing just over her shoulder, peering up at the huge structure with such a blank expression that he could have been a wax statue. She started to say. "Do you think they're okay?" His dazed eyes finally met hers. "Brent and Mari can take care of themselves, and I'd rather not let them down, so we've got a lot to do. No time to mess around." Dak had sat up straight with his back against the stone. "Great. They sent the most annoying person in that whole operations room with us. Just great." "Dak," Rick retorted, "be glad you're a little kid, or I'd break your nose about 5 times to make myself feel better. You think I want to be here?" Dak glared, but kept quiet. "Sorry," the older boy muttered. He walked away, went over to sit on a rock that jutted from the sand. "I just wasn't ready for this. There are people back there I may never see again." Sera sighed. The shock of everything had almost overwhelmed the fact that they were sitting at the foot of an actual Egyptian pyramid, and the blocks of stone looked much newer than she would have imagined, which meant they'd come far into the past, just as she'd hoped. She wanted to be as distant from the SQ as possible, both in time and geography. She looked at the imposing structure, knowing she should be more impressed, but her eagerness to get on with things outweighed all else. She stood up and slapped the dust from her pants. She grabbed the infinity ring in one hand and took the satchel from Dak, then held both items out in front of her. "Hey, look at me," she said. "We need to start using these things the way they were meant to be used. If we do what the historians asked, then maybe when we go back, the SQ will never have attacked, and we'll all be living fat and happy." "Wait a second," Dak replied, seeming deep in thought. "If we change history, then maybe we change our future lives, and if there's no need for breaks to be corrected, then maybe we never build a time travel device, and the breaks that didn't need fixing never get fixed, and—" He stopped, his expression having changed to complete confusion. Sera knew what he was getting at. "Better not to even go there. Time paradoxes are way too complicated, and we don't know for sure how they work. That's why we can't risk going back to our own time." "We can't go home again, huh?" Rick asked. "Not until we've done everything Brent's asked of us. What if we go back home and the infinity ring blinks out of existence before we fixed all the breaks?" "You can make another one," Dak said. "Couldn't you?" "You're assuming I wouldn't blink out of existence, too." "That could happen?" Rick asked. He looked deeply troubled by the idea. "The whole point is that I don't know. Look." She put the ring in the satchel and handed it to Dak, then took a stick from the ground, using it to draw a line in the sand. "Time is like a river, right? That's what time stream means. The current is flowing in one direction, toward the future, and we're all being pulled along for the ride. The ring, of course, lets us move upstream or downstream at will." "Oh, goody," said Rick. "A metaphor. They didn't tell me you were a poet, too." "Here's a poem," said Dak. "Roses are red, violets are blue. Please just shut up, why don't you?" "I've got the speaking stick." Sera raised the stick. "And it doubles as a hitting stick. So both of you be quiet." "Time, river. Got it," said Dak. "Now imagine the breaks as great big boulders that have been plopped into the time stream. The stream keeps flowing, but it has to veer a little bit from its natural course, working its way around the boulders. It's not a completely different river. It still gets where it was going for the most part, but there are subtle changes all along its length. Ripples. Remnants.
And as we remove the boulders, Rick added, the river goes back to normal.
Right, but we can't say for sure what normal looks like. As long as we're moving from place to place with the Infinity Ring, we're anomalies, and we're immune to the changes we're causing. But when we return to our proper time, who knows?
So, we won't be affected? Dak asked.
Our memories will stay intact? And the ring, too?
That's the theory, Dak. I'm sorry, but this is all uncharted territory here. All I know for sure is that the second we start changing things, the timeline will be in flux and we won't be able to take anything for granted. All we can do is make the changes the historians tell us to and hope for the best. Otherwise, we might go back to discover the planet as a chunk of dead rock floating through space.
Rick moved closer and eyed the satchel in Dak's hands.
Okay, fine. So how in the world do we know what to do? They didn't tell me anything about the breaks, their locations, nothing. I started my training in the art of memory, but hadn't gotten too far.
Then it's a good thing 2 out of 3 of us are smart,
Dak said, stepping up beside Rick.
We'll figure it out. You just be a good boy and translate.
Rick laughed, which made Dak's face grow red. How many languages do you know, by the way? I forgot.
1,
Dak said, in a deadpan voice.
Ah, okay. When I need help with English, I'll come to you. And when I need help on how to look stupider, I'll come to you.
Rick pointed a finger at Dak's ear.
Just remember, as impressive as that device is, it won't help you with reading and writing. You're basically illiterate now. Just saying.
Sera cleared her throat. Dak was usually so quick to trust strangers. She wondered if Rick reminded Dak a little too much of himself.
You guys finished?
She asked. They each gave the other a dirty look, but then nodded at her.
For the love of mincemeat. Dak, you can't be dumb and learn tons of languages. And Rick, you better be nice to my best friend. He knows more about history than your bosses. I guarantee it. She waited a moment to make sure she'd put their argument to rest, then took a deep breath. Dak, there's something else. I've been thinking about your parents, and I think they're anomalies too.
Dak got serious, fast.
What does that mean? They warped out with us, but they didn't warp back in. That means they were lost in transit. Without the ring to steer them, they'll be completely unanchored, hopping through the time stream like skipping stones. But I don't think their movements will be entirely random. As untethered anomalies, they should theoretically be drawn to other anomalies in the time stream. Theoretically? Dak echoed. I'm getting so tired of that word. What I mean to say is that I think they'll be drawn to the breaks, which means as big a place as time is, there's a very real chance we'll encounter them in the course of our mission.
Dak took a moment to consider what she'd said. Then he held out the satchel.
Let's get on with it, then.
Sera couldn't have agreed more. She sat down, pulled the square out of the satchel, and turned it on. Dak and Rick crowded around her to see what appeared on the screen. There were just 2 sentences, white letters on a black background, with an input box below them. You have 1 chance to type password. Fail, and device will explode. Chapter 17. Finger Tapping.
You're kidding me,
Sera said.
All of that talking, and they forgot to give us the password?
Dak had felt a little quiver in his gut, too. Here they were in ancient Egypt. He took yet another look at the Great Pyramid of Giza, still in disbelief that he was standing at the foot of something he'd dreamed about seeing for years, with nothing to guide them on what to do next except a square device that was locked to them. But man, the air smelled clean and fresh, like it hadn't been tainted by a few thousand years of humans doing what they do. Everything looked sharper, too. He couldn't help feeling optimistic.
We'll just have to take a guess,
Dak said.
Maybe it's historian.
Rick scoffed. Yeah, why don't you go ahead and type that in? Give it a whirl. If it blows up, oh well. Dak would have loved to punch the guy right in the stomach. If only there wouldn't be consequences like, for example, getting beaten up in retaliation. I didn't mean to just go ahead and do it, moron. I was throwing out ideas. Maybe you should try to actually contribute something? I'm about to smack the both of you, Sera said evenly, and her hardened face showed she meant it. You two haven't even known each other long enough to be enemies. Cut it out. Seems plenty long enough to me, Dak grumbled. I mean it, Sera snapped. She returned her attention to the screen. The more I think about it, the harder it is to believe they would have sent us away with this if we couldn't find a way to figure out the password. We just need to think about it for a while. Once we agree on something, all we can do is try it. But it has to be logical, Rick said. We can't take any wild guesses. He didn't look at Dak when he said it, but Dak knew it was a jab at him. Sera turned the device off and folded her hands on top of it. All right, then. Let's all think. No talking for a few minutes. Dak pressed his back against the bottom of the pyramid. Seriously, he thought. How cool is this? And put his head in his hands, closing his eyes. He'd memorized the 2 sentences and ran through them in his mind. Thinking back to their short time at the historian headquarters, he tried to remember if either Brent or Mari might have said something that could have been a clue to the password. But nothing came to mind. Frustrated, he wondered if maybe the message on the square itself was a clue. He pictured the words in his mind. You have 1 chance to type password. Fail, and device will explode. I think I might know what we need to do, Rick said. It has to be related to explosives somehow. Bombs. Fail-safes. Bombs have fail-safes, right? A way to make sure they don't explode? Was all Sera got out. I doubt any of us are experts on that. Well, Rick replied, maybe we can hike our way to a local village and ask someone around here about it. Get them to help us figure it out. Dak was astounded. You're a historian? You really think people in ancient Egypt had bombs, especially electronic bombs with fail-safes built into the device? Rick looked up at the pyramid. Well, no, I suppose not. Got any better ideas? Dak went back to brooding with the others. He closed his eyes again to block everything out. Then it hit him, fast and hard. I've got it! He yelled, standing up. Sera and Rick jumped at his sudden exclamation, and Dak relished the briefest hint of wounded pride that flashed across his new rival's face. What? Sera asked. Spit it out. We're thinking too much, Dak said. Just like anyone else would. But because we know absolutely nothing about this, there's no way they'd let us risk destroying the thing by guessing at passwords. So they told us what to do, right in front of our eyes. He saw a flicker of understanding in the others, and he hurried to spit out the solution before either of them could claim they'd figured it out too. Password. We need to type that word. Password. That's it. Sera and Rick exchanged doubtful looks. What else could it possibly be? Dak asked them. That's really risky, Sera finally said. What if it's wrong? Duh! Dak threw up his hands in frustration. What if any word we come up with is wrong? Got any better ideas? It seems obvious to me. I think he's right, Rick said, which irritated Dak slightly because it made it harder to hate the guy. If we only have 1 chance, it would have to be something that stands out once you see it, and that does, plain and simple. Sera slowly nodded while biting her lower lip. I guess I'm just scared to death to actually try anything. We only have 1 shot. Dak shrugged. That's why you should type it in. Go for it. Why not you? Because I'm the history expert. They need me. Badly. I think you mean history nerd, Rick muttered under his breath. Well, technically you're right, Dak said. As any real language expert should know, the origin of the word dates back to the mid-20th century. Maybe later, Sera interrupted. As engaging as that sounds, let's focus on this right now.
Okay,
Dak said. Hand it over. I'll do it. He had a burst of confidence that he was right about what to input. Taking the device from Sera, he took a seat and turned it on. The same 2 sentences popped up on the screen. He drew in a breath, tapped the box, typed out password on the virtual keyboard, then clicked the OK button. The screen instantly flashed white, and for about half a second, Dak thought it was the beginning of a massive explosion that would incinerate him, but then words started to appear. Break number 1. Sally forth, astute and wise, search the page, find the prize. Centuries pass, mind and heart devoted to the memory's art. Dak smiled. What did I tell you? I solved it with my eyes closed. But his victory was short-lived. Below the poem was the most confusing image Dak had ever seen. A hodgepodge of circles and broken lines and shapes. There were Greek letters on one side of the image and the word lagoon on the other. What the heck is that? He asked. Spain, Rick whispered. We need to go to Spain.